Kia ora koutou. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that today, as we debate the future of Auckland, we learn that in a global survey of quality of life in cities, that Auckland ranks fourth equal with Vancouver out of a total of some 221 cities surveyed around the world. Some distance ahead of Wellington at number 12, I might add. Auckland clearly is seen by objective international observers as a good place to live, a good place to do business, better than 216 other cities that were surveyed. And that's very refreshing news. That's very reassuring news to those of us who are Aucklanders. And we're getting quite weary of being told how broken our city, or indeed our cities, are and have been, and how it's necessary for Wellington, for central government, to intervene in order to fix our cities. And there's no doubt we could have done better. There are opportunities have been missed. We're not yet number one on that survey of 221, but it's quite clear that the degree of brokenness has been seriously overstated, and one has to wonder at the agenda that is driving that exaggeration of what the situation in Auckland. This notion that Auckland is a broken cot case overlooks the fact that very positive progress was made over recent years. Those of us who have worked closely with various city councils in various guises over a number of years know that the Merrill Forum was starting to get some good positive outcomes. We know that the regional land transport strategy was starting to get traction. There was starting to be an emerging awareness of the value of cooperation within and between councils, and that their individual goals and common objectives of those cities and districts was served best by a degree of common working together. The individual councils were making their mark in some very positive ways. Waitakere City, with its eco-city vision, had built a unique character identity for the West, which was having some very good positive and ongoing outcomes. Manukau City succeeded in the face of some really serious social and economic challenges to meld together the very diverse communities within Manukau and to improve the quality of life for those communities. The North Shore has done some really good and useful stuff in terms of managing the extraordinary growth pressures that they've experienced over recent years, in part through immigration, through natural growth, and people simply wanting to live in a very pleasant part of the country, part of the city. Within and across all of the cities and districts, there was an emerging sense of place, a sense that a commitment to improving the parts and indeed the sum of the parts that was the Auckland region. It's always been apparent to the Greens, at least, that a much less radical intervention could have resolved the admitted problems that did exist in Auckland and that do exist. The assignment of some more powers to the regional council to break the deadlock where councils couldn't agree, in order to enable networks, combined infrastructure projects and so on to go ahead. Simply assigning some more authority to the regional council could have achieved those same ends. But regrettably, the rhetoric of crisis, of catastrophe, of failure has won the day, and the wholesale tearing of the social and political fabric of the region has been the consequence. Now, since the report back to this House of the Select Committee report, the Select Committee has sort of won some praise, has been credited with smoothing some of the roughest edges of this bill off the original. But in fact, the credit should go to the thousands of Aucklanders who made submissions, who lobbied their MPs, who wrote letters, who organised protests, who went on a hikoi to make their point. But ultimately they were disappointed that so many of their very legitimate concerns and complaints and objections to the loss of democracy, the loss of accountability, the loss of autonomy were essentially ignored in the final product that's come out of the Select Committee process. The New Zealand Herald, in a rather generous turn of phrase, suggested in fact there had been a U-turn between the original bill and what came out of the Select Committee. But the sad fact is that far from being a 180-degree U-turn, we've at best achieved a shift, a change of direction of a few degrees in the overall structure and direction of this proposed monolith, the Super Council. A U-turn, a genuine U-turn, would have seen genuine Māori representation allowed for, would have honoured Te Tiriti, would have honoured the recommendation of the Royal Commission that said we ought to have established Māori seats on the council, and thousands of Māori and non-Māori marched together in the rain in support of that principle and were ignored. At that point, the Minister for Local Government threatened to resign if, in fact, we got dedicated Maori seats. And just for a moment, one could hear a pin drop while people held their breath in hope and expectation. But unfortunately, the bluff was not called. A U-turn would have seen the minister abandon the idea of establishing council uncontrolled, or indeed council controlling organisations, and left the incoming council to make their own assessment, their own perception of needs, and develop their own mechanisms for meeting those needs. A genuine U-turn would have seen Aucklanders left with the rights that every other New Zealander enjoys: the right to propose reorganisation of local government, the right to propose a change toward a democratic electoral system. These are rights denied Aucklanders until at least the end of 2013. The Associate Professor of Law Andrew Geddes, in analysing and critiquing the debacle in ECAN, in which Cantabrians have lost their rights to democratically elect their regional councillors until 2013, asks readers of his analysis, and I quote, "Imagine a situation in which Aucklanders have the right to appeal their regional government's decisions, but Cantabrians do not." Well, for Aucklanders, this would come as no surprise, because we've become very accustomed to the idea that this government will and does remove rights from some sections of society. As I've said, Aucklanders have lost until 2013 their right to appeal for reorganisation of boundaries. We've lost the right to propose changes to the electoral system, and both of these rights are available to all other New Zealanders, but with the passing of this bill we will lose those rights, and it's hard to find anybody beyond Mr Hyde and his inner circle who believe that is right or who believe that is fair. Citizens outside of Auckland and indeed of Canterbury might do well to consider where this anti-democratic axe might next fall. What inconvenient legal provision or right of citizens might it suit this government's self-interest to overturn by misusing their majority in this House? The denial of democracy in Canterbury and in Auckland sets a very dangerous precedent, and one that other areas, other regions, other cities would do well to observe and keep an eye on. Perhaps the meanest cut of all for Aucklanders is the fact that we can predict with absolute certainty, perhaps the only thing we can confidently predict, that the outcome of this reshaping of Auckland in the minister's sometimes rather less than lovely image is that it will cost us dearly. It will cost us hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And even the minister, I believe, has stopped pretending that there will be a rates reduction coming as a result of the reorganisation, recalling this was one of the great hopes of people when they conceded to the notion of a reorganisation. Even in the unlikely event that there are in the future some operational savings, it would be many years before the benefits would outweigh the massive cost of this reorganisation. Would any public or indeed private company embark on a major restructuring without having done a rigorous cost-benefit analysis, measuring all the costs, all the benefits, and putting them on some timeline? Of course not, but in the reality is that's exactly what has happened in this change in Auckland. And Aucklanders for at least a generation will be picking up the tab for this hopelessly muddled attempt at solving a problem that was never as severe as we were told, or that as central government would have us believe. We've seen the first instalment of this very costly process as the ATA has already gone way past its guesstimated budget, and has asked for another $73 million, which the central government generously is loaning to Auckland and will expect to be paid back. It is beyond the pale that Auckland is paying for this massive upheaval that we don't want, didn't need, and that has been imposed on us by this minister and by this government. Kia ora koutou.
Very good.